Margaret Holloway stood in her kitchen on a Tuesday morning, her silver-grey hair catching the light through the window.
At 58, she had the kind of face that showed both strength and gentleness.
She wore her favorite cream-colored sweater, the one that always made her feel grounded. The phone rang again. She stared at it, remembering what they had told her. "You should be grateful we still answer your calls," Margaret, her daughter-in-law, Vanessa, had said just last week.
The words had stuck more than Margaret wanted to admit. For 32
years, Margaret had been married to Douglas. They had built a life together in their modest home in Ohio.
They raised their son, Christopher, with love and care.
Or so she thought. Margaret remembered the early years.
Douglas had been attentive then, bringing her flowers from the grocery store, holding her hand during evening walks. But somewhere along the way, things had changed.
The warmth faded. The conversations grew shorter.
The distance between them became a chasm. She had stayed, though.
That's what her generation did. You worked through the hard times. You honored your commitments. Then came the discovery. It was a Saturday afternoon, 6 months ago. Margaret had been looking for their insurance papers when she found the folder tucked behind Douglas's desk drawer. Inside were bank statements she'd never seen before, credit card bills for restaurants she'd never been to,
hotel receipts from cities she'd never visited, and there were photographs. Douglas with a woman named Lorraine.
They were laughing in one photo, sitting close in another. The dates on the receipts went back 5 years. 5 years of deception. Margaret had confronted him that evening.
Douglas didn't deny it.
He simply looked tired, as if the burden of maintaining 2 lives had finally worn him down. "I haven't been happy for a long time, Margaret," he said quietly. "And I have been," she replied, her voice steady despite the breaking of her heart. The divorce had been swift. Douglas moved out within a month, taking half of everything they'd built together. But what hurt Margaret most was Christopher's reaction. Her son had sided with his father completely. "Dad says you were cold to him for years," Christopher had told her over coffee, his voice lacking any warmth. "Maybe if you'd been
more supportive, more understanding, he wouldn't have needed to find comfort elsewhere." Margaret had sat there, stunned into silence. Was this truly her son speaking?
The boy she had rocked to sleep, nursed through fevers, cheered at baseball games.
Vanessa had been even worse. She made it clear that family gatherings would be awkward if Margaret attended.
That Douglas deserved happiness. That Margaret should move on gracefully. The phone calls became lectures. Reminders that she should be thankful they still maintained contact at all.
That she shouldn't make things difficult. As Margaret had made
a decision. She stopped calling. 81st. It felt strange. She would reach for her phone on Sunday mornings, wanting to hear Christopher's voice, wanting to ask about her grandchildren. But she would set the phone down again. Days turned into weeks. Weeks turned into months. The silence was difficult at first. Margaret would wake up feeling the weight of loneliness pressing against her chest. But slowly, something unexpected happened. She
began to breathe easier. Margaret started taking morning walks again, something she hadn't done in years.
She joined a book club at the local library.
She volunteered at the community garden, her hands remembering the joy of working with soil
and seeds. One afternoon, while having tea with her new friend Patricia, she shared her story. Patricia listened carefully, her eyes full of understanding. "You know what you've given yourself," Patricia said gently. "Freedom. You've stopped begging for crumbs of affection from people who should have loved you unconditionally." The words settled into Margaret's heart like truth often does. She thought about Douglas and Lorraine, about Christopher and Vanessa.
She thought about the years of small dismissals, the gradual erosion of her worth in their eyes. And then Margaret
did something calculated,
something that surprised even herself. She began transferring her accounts. Douglas had always handled their finances, but the divorce settlement had left Margaret with several accounts in her name.
Joint accounts that still bore her signature, credit cards she had never asked to be removed from. Over the course of 3 months, Margaret systematically transferred everything that was legally hers into new accounts that only she controlled.
She updated her will, removing Christopher as executor and beneficiary. She designated her assets to go to the charities she had come to care about, the library, the community garden, the women's shelter. She closed the joint accounts after
ensuring every penny that belonged to her was secured. She changed her phone number. The silence that followed was profound. Margaret didn't hear from Christopher for 2 months after that.
When he finally appeared at her door, it wasn't concern on his face.
It was alarm. "Moem, what have you done?" he asked, his voice tight. The bank called Dad saying you closed the joint accounts. Vanessa tried to reach you and your number doesn't work. Margaret stood in her doorway, looking at this man who was her son but felt like a stranger. I did what you all suggested, she said calmly. I moved on gracefully. I stopped making things difficult. I stopped calling, but we
Didn't mean what, Christopher? Didn't mean I should actually have dignity. Didn't mean I should stop accepting crumbs.
He looked uncomfortable.
We're family. Family, Margaret repeated softly. Family doesn't gaslight you into believing betrayal is your fault. Family doesn't make you feel grateful for the bare minimum of respect. Christopher's face reddened.
Dad needs help with some expenses. And we thought, and there it was. The truth. They hadn't come because they missed her.
They had come because they needed something from her. Margaret felt a strange sense of peace wash over her. I've
made arrangements for my assets, Christopher. They'll go to organizations that actually appreciate kindness and contribution.
You and your father made your choices. Now I've made mine. You're being vindictive, he said, anger creeping into his voice. No, Margaret replied gently. I'm being free. There's a difference. She closed the door softly, leaving him standing on the porch. That evening, Margaret sat
in her kitchen with a cup of tea, looking out at the garden she had started to tend. Spring was coming. She could see the first shoots of green pushing through the soil. Life had taught her something valuable in these past months. Sometimes love means letting go. Sometimes kindness to yourself looks like removing yourself from those who diminish you. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is stop fighting for a place at a table where you are not truly welcome. Margaret had spent years believing that patience and endurance were her greatest virtues.
Now she understood that knowing your worth and protecting your peace were equally important. The phone that no one could reach sat silent on the counter. But Margaret's world was anything but quiet.
It was full of morning light, genuine friendships, purposeful work, and the gentle satisfaction of a life being rebuilt on her own terms. She had been told she should be grateful they answered her. Calls.so she stopped calling, and in that silence, Margaret found something she hadn't felt in years. She found herself. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is walk away with grace, not because you're giving up, but because you're
finally choosing yourself.